Hey music lovers, Sara J here. Looking for an inclusive space where you can connect with fellow fans, deep dive into your favorite music, and be a part of something special? Well, look no further. Join us on Patreon, where music and community come together. Get exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and a place to geek out over the artists you love, plus explore music you haven't heard yet. Come hang out with us. Patreon.com/DATC Media Company. That's patreon.com/DATC Media Company. See you there. A member of the DATC Media family. Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this week of Dropped Among This Crowd. I'm your host, Sara J. I hope you had a chance to check out last week's episode, my absolutely awesome conversation with Brady Callan. He is a Canadian digital creator and interview host, and we talked about his Instagram page. I'll link it in the show notes, of course. But we talked about his page that's been around for 2 years now and all of the amazing content that he puts over there. He has so much knowledge about Canadian music, Canadian classic rock, all sorts of stuff. He talked about his first concert, which was Kiss. That was such a fun story to hear. That's just skimming the surface of the conversation. Definitely do yourself a favor and go back and listen to that if you haven't yet, because we had such a blast. This week, we're going to dive into something a little different, but kind of along the same lines of some of the other episodes that I've put out this year. A few episodes ago, I shared my favorite books, and I just recently listened to a phenomenal 5-part podcast series from BBC Sounds called Eras. I'll link it in the show notes so you can find it easily. This was actually season 7. Past seasons have featured Queen, Bob Marley, Sting, ABBA, The Beatles, and Kylie Minogue. I haven't had a chance to dig into those yet, but they are most definitely on my listening list. This season 7 5-part series was about Phil Collins, and if you know me or if you've listened to the show for any sort of length of time, I talk pretty regularly about Genesis and Phil Collins and being a fan, and definitely both of those aforementioned band and artists have been a part of my musical foundation and live music experiences for sure. So I know a lot about Phil Collins. I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means, but I know a lot about his story. And listening to this 5-part miniseries, there was so much that I still learned. I'm really excited to listen to the other seasons that they put out, especially about Sting and ABBA and Kylie Minogue. I really don't know anything about, so that's going to be really awesome. And I highly recommend that you check out this season for sure, but go back and check those other seasons out. Just very awesome. This series actually starts with the formative years of Phil Collins' life, exploring how his early experiences shaped the musician he would become. And it was so fun to hear how he got his first drum and how his uncles, with air quotes because they were, family friends, played such a role in that, and how it really was just something that he was naturally drawn to doing. And hearing the story of him acting as a young child and all of these different things. It was so great. And it wraps up this episode 5 wraps up with the host Zoe Ball sitting down with Phil, giving a firsthand perspective of his life, career, and reflections. And she shares some really nice audio clips from Jimmy Page is one, thoughts that friends and family had about certain parts in his career, and then his response to those, and that was really special for sure. So this was just a fascinating listen from beginning to end. From those beginnings, we get a front row look at how a shy, very shy, talented drummer would eventually become a global superstar. Like, seriously. And that brings us to his early career with Genesis, originally formed by the just wildly creative Peter Gabriel. Genesis in the early 70s, just, if you know, you know. We could definitely do a whole podcast episode about my nerdy love for Genesis. I feel like I just haven't fully opened that, and just maybe someday I think I need to. So if you know the history of Genesis, Peter Gabriel leaves the band. And this is where their story gets really, really interesting. They auditioned over 400 singers, and eventually Phil just stepped up. It was actually his first wife, he says in part 5, that, pushed him to, was just like, well, why don't you do it? Not because he wanted to front the band, but because someone had to. And he even references that in the part 5 when Zoe brings up the Genesis concert that she saw when she was young, and the double drum jam during the show with Chester. And he says that was his favorite part of the show because he didn't have to sing. And that shift literally changed everything. Genesis gradually moved from progressive art rock to more accessible songwriting, and eventually just these huge arena-sized tours and all these accolades and hits and charting singles, and they go through all of it. It's so very interesting to hear. And fun fact that I learned was that Princess Diana, yes, Lady Di, was a huge Genesis fan. She even went to their concerts in the 80s. He tells the story of Prince Charles's birthday party. I'm not going to give you any more. I want you to listen to this 5-part series because it's just great. It's just so much fun to learn these fun little things. So then the series moves into Phil's solo career. He releases his first album, Face Value, in 1981. Iconic album cover, and he talks about that as well. And it includes a little song called In the Air Tonight. Iconic song. You know this song. The slow build, the tension, and then that drum fill. Easily one of the most iconic and recognizable drum fills in history of the planet. What most people don't know, I didn't know this, is that the drum sound came from a happy accident with producer and engineer Hugh Padden while working on sessions with Peter Gabriel, specifically his third solo album. They stumbled onto the graded reverb drum sound. The results, huge, punchy, and dramatic. And Phil brought it to his solo work. That drum fill in the air tonight, it's not complicated. It's honestly iconic, I think, because of restraint. He waits. He builds the tension and then boom. It's literally a masterclass in dynamics. And that is something that's talked about several times throughout this podcast series. And then they, of course, talk about it in that part 5 where Zoe talks to Phil about these moments in his career. Also, if you want to go even deeper into Phil's story, I mentioned his autobiography in my favorite reads episode, number 322. His autobiography is titled Not Dead Yet, an absolute must read. I'm actually going to go back and reread it now after listening to this podcast series because I think it's been 6 or 7 years since I read that book. So I am definitely going to reread that now that I listened to this. So a definite Sara J recommendation, the Phil Collins autobiography, Not Dead Yet. I will link it in the show notes too. And again, I always say, check your local library before you order from Amazon. Early 80s Phil Collins was everywhere. And for me, I will be 42 this year. I was born in 1984. So, yeah, it was everywhere. And after listening to this podcast series, even more so than I thought, because he was producing and playing drums and collaborating with all of these other artists, like Eric Clapton. Clapton's 1981 album, Another Ticket, came out the same year as Phil's solo debut, and Collins played on the hit I Can't Stand It. And it's fascinating to hear about how interconnected this scene was. Like Peter Gabriel's solo work, Phil's solo album, Genesis evolving, Clapton rebuilding his career. It's just this very cool, strange, overlapping web of British rock icons influencing each other in real time. And if you know me, you know I was just loving every second of this. So cool to hear how all of these little things were just moving and connecting and inspiring and dominoing all of these other things. Just so cool. And something else that I learned, very few artists have achieved massive success, both as a solo performer and as part of a band. Phil Collins is one of them. Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson are the other two artists who have achieved massive success both as a solo performer and as part of a band. That was pretty impressive. I never even really thought about that until after this, really kind of marinating on it. So that was pretty fascinating. So then we get to Live Aid, 1985, one of the biggest live music events ever. There's 2 main stages, London and Philadelphia. So Phil performed at Wembley Stadium in London. Then he got on the Concorde, flew across the Atlantic, and performed again in Philadelphia the same day. He played solo with Eric Clapton and also with Led Zeppelin. 2 continents, 1 day. Incredible. Legendary. Does not even begin to cover it. And that doesn't even totally scratch the surface of everything else that came after it. And someone in the podcast series, it was in part 4, brought this up. She was of the younger generation, and she brought up Phil Collins' work on the Tarzan soundtrack I loved that movie, and the soundtrack was absolutely amazing. It was literally like a Phil Collins solo album. It's not like he just wrote one song for this movie. No, he literally wrote an entire album for this movie. It was amazing. And I remember the drumming scene in the movie with the gorilla. And so to hear that, hear her say that really made me think. And I would love to hear from you, my listeners. Which era do you remember Phil Collins from? Is it Genesis in the 70s? Is it his solo career? Is it maybe the Tarzan soundtrack? It's very interesting to me where the different generations are drawing their knowledge from of Phil Collins, because there's just been these huge iconic moments in his life where, depending on your age, I think it would depend on what you would remember your experience and being exposed to him from. So drop me a DM. I'm really, really interested to hear what people have to say about that. And as I said at the top of the show, Phil Collins was definitely a foundational musical part of my childhood. My parents were both huge fans, huge Genesis fans. My mom is a huge Peter Gabriel fan. And so it was just something that was such a part of my childhood. And then, of course, combine the fact that he had this massive solo career at the same time. So I saw Phil Collins a few times when I was a kid. I remember my mom taking photos of at least one of the shows. We used to go see shows at Walnut Creek in Raleigh, North Carolina, about 3 hours from where I grew up on the coast. But one moment that will always stand out, my little brother was probably 3 at the time. And during the concert, Phil was reaching down in the front and, kind of touching hands of all the people in the front. And he touched my brother's hand. And my brother was beyond excited. And if you're a parent, you'll appreciate this next part of the story, because he was so excited about it, he didn't want to wash his hand, and he's 3. You got to wash your hands, right? So my mom, when we got home, took a piece of duct tape and put it on his hand, and then was on there for a second, and then just pulled it off, and she put it on the back of the door and was like, okay, it's on the tape and it's on the back of the door, so you're totally okay to wash your hands. And my brother, being 3, he believed that, but he was able to keep his Phil Collins memento, and he had a little lisp when he was little, so when he said Phil Collins, it was just absolutely the cutest. So that's a fun little story. And tip for all you parents out there: if your kid touches their musical icon's hand at a show, use the duct tape trick to stick the tape to the back of the door and say, it's on there now. There you go. And that tape stayed on the door for a long time, until he got a little older, and then we're like, oh, okay. It's just kind of there, so it was really, really funny. And I mean, come on, I'm 42 and I'm still telling that story. So moments like that will stick with you forever. And I can remember being at that show and that moment when it was just 2 seconds of time. Phil walked by and tapped his hand, and the look on his face, he was just so excited. And that just shows what kind of performer Phil is and was, connecting with people of all ages. And that's why I was so fascinated when that was brought up in part 4. I was like, yeah, that's very interesting to find out where would be the place that you would be exposed to Phil Collins first. And it would be cool to see where the congruency lies of generation to that point in his career. So, yeah, I mean, this was just absolutely a phenomenal listen to. Like I said, check it out. Check out those other seasons. I will for sure be checking those out. Who knows, I might be inspired to do another episode when I listen to those, because I have no doubt that I'm going to be blown away with knowledge. And you know I love it. I'm super excited to dive into that Queen one first. That's definitely where I'm starting, because I love Queen. So I know that I'm going to learn something new for sure. So yes, definitely give that a listen. Pop that on now after I am done talking and check it out, because you will not be disappointed. The episodes are 30 minutes each, and there's 5 parts, so that's really great. There is so much information packed into those 30 minutes. You're just going to be like, whoa, so good. So check that out. The BBC Sounds series Eras, Season 7 with Phil Collins. I will link it in the show notes. I think that is everything I have for this week of the show. Check out the website for any available guest spots for here on the show, and check out the Patreon, all sorts of fun content always over there, patreon.com/DATC Media Company. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I will see you around these parts next week. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Please be sure to leave a review of the show. It would mean so much to me, and it helps get this podcast into the ears of even more fellow music fans. If you're not already following the show on social media, find us on Facebook and Instagram at Dropped Among This Crowd Podcast, or check out datcmediacompany.com for more. Thank you again. I'll see you around these parts real soon. Mad love.